Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for hosting such a lovely lunch. Thank you all for coming here. I know how busy you are, and I truly appreciate the time you're putting in. And I really want to just say that thank you for the Israel Project. You do such amazing professional work, and it's a great contribution to the political debate and to having an intelligent, fact-based debate. So thank you very much. I'll start with, I know that the great interest here today, and we're going to talk about it, is the question of the United Nations vote, and I'm sure that for each one of you, in terms of your work with your countries, they want to hear your perspectives on that. But I'll start with a bit of a broader view of kind of how we see right now the situation, the region, and what are the implications for the Israeli-Palestinian issue, if at all. And from there, I'll take it to the more specific question at hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellencies. I think there's one here. Thank you very much for joining.
So undoubtedly, one of the most interesting things that is happening right now in our region is clearly not the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and I think for many of us it's a relief. It's nice to be out of the limelight and to be a sideshow, and I actually hope that these will be the proper proportions for a long time to come. But no doubt this is the most interesting and exhilarating thing that is happening in our region. It's certainly a change on the order, on the scale, in terms of the impact on the region of the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of World War I that shaped the modern Middle East, the end of World War II. I think this is the kind of moment we're at now. And it's a hopeful moment. It's one where there's an incredible vision as we think about it, the ability or the option that we will see a Middle East of countries that are democratic, open, respecting of the equality between men and women, of minorities. This is an incredible vision, and one that I'm sure all of us hope to see emerging from the Middle East. It's certainly one that we would like to see in Israel. For a long time, I think Israel was pointed out to having failed to integrate into the Middle East. The obvious reason typically being about the fact that Israel was the homeland of the Jewish people in a region that did not appreciate it, but there was always also the question of values. And I remember thinking, I'd like to think of myself as an independent, modern woman, and I would look around the region and I would think, yes, we would like to be integrated into the region, but I can't be integrated into the values that I see around me, especially when it came, for example, to the question of the treatment of women. And we're seeing that hopefully change. And it gives us the greatest prospects long-term and going forward for peace, true peace. The one that comes when neighbors actually share values and feel that they look at the other side of the border and they recognize those on the other side of the border as being ones with which they share values and whose values they can respect. So I think this is really, as we look long-term, it is the greatest hope the region has, I think, not just for its people, but for peace in general. But also, I would have to say the truth, which is many Israelis are looking at the revolutions also with a sense of fear, not just one of hope and anticipation, because we don't know where it might lead. We know what the positive scenario is, but we cannot ignore the negative ones. We cannot ignore a scenario where after the initial euphoria of revolution comes the need to deal with the real problems. And the problems are not going away just because a dictator has been deposed. In fact, many times the problems become worse because of a revolution, income from tourism, economic life, capital. All these things are becoming more difficult, and so the problems of the countries are even exacerbated in some cases by the revolutions. And the question is, will the people be able to go through the very, very long process that it will take in order to rebuild their societies, their economies, or will we see populist waves where anger at the situation is being deflected, for example, towards Israel? We've seen it happen before. I sometimes joke that Israel is the best thing that happened to the Middle East in the sense that there was always the scapegoat. You could always blame Israel for everything that was wrong and never deal with your own problems, because dealing with your own problems on a personal life is difficult, and it's always easier to blame others. And this is an issue of concern for us. Will the people and the countries of the Middle East be able to break the habit of looking to Israel, of blaming Israel, and focusing on their own problems? I think, if anything, for many years, people have been taught that Israel is the problem of the Middle East. I think, if anything, if we look at Israel's model, it is a solution. What Israel has, openness, democracy, but also respect for tradition, a careful balancing of traditional loyalties with a modern secular society, is, I think, what a lot of the societies and countries around us would like to achieve for themselves: an open, dynamic, innovative economy that looks to the world. So I think we really have an opportunity to see a single region to be integrated into the region, but it will require, it's going to be a long process, and it will require for people to focus on their own building rather than deflecting anger outside. So this is where we are today, I think, in terms of the broader region. As an aside, I will say, I'm sure you've heard that in the beginning we thought that Israel was a bit, if we talk in parallel to what happened here, we're a bit in the eye of the storm. So for us it was very calm. Israel was very quiet for a very long time. And just around us, the region was in this storm. Recently, we've had our little storm as well. There have been social protests in Israel, but I would say they were very nice protests. Someone even described them as being very joyous and happy ones. They've been very calm. And actually, because the security situation has been so calm for the last 2 to 3 years, because the economy has been doing so well, and inspired by the courage of the youngsters in the Arab nations, I think we now have our own social protests but the Israeli version. So now the question of social justice is coming up in Israel, of course in our own specific context, and I think this is also a small example of Israel integrating to the region for the first time in a way that has to do with positive elements, because for the first time Israelis looked to young people in the Arab world not as a source of danger, not as potential enemies, not as militants, but as a source of inspiration. So the fact that Israelis would go to these protests and we would have signs that would talk about Tahrir Square in Egypt as a source of inspiration. I think this is a small example of what could happen once you have a region where people share the same values. You will see the youngsters across the regions actually being inspired by each other. Now, in terms of what all of this might mean to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, first, I think what has happened is that it put it in the proper proportion. And that's a good thing. for a very long time, there was this tendency to look at the Israeli-Palestinian issue as somehow being at the center of global politics, as being incredibly important to the future of global politics, and if not global politics, at least to the region. And I think what we're seeing with all these revolutions is that there are far more important issues for the future and prosperity and even peace of the region that have to do with the Arab countries themselves. And I think this change of view and of proportions is healthy. And it's good because I think it's more accurate and more reflective of where the true issues are and where the world community needs to invest its energies. So I think it's actually good that we're being pushed aside. I think the Israeli government has been very wise throughout this process to basically keep silent, not to draw any attention. I think also what we've seen is another positive development where the big lie, which I referred to, that Israel was the cause of miseries, the problem in the Middle East, the Arab youngsters themselves rejected that, which I think is also a very optimistic notion that you can sometimes tell people a lie throughout their lives and they will still recognize it as a lie. And what you saw, for example, that when dictators like Gaddafi or Assad tried to say the rebels are part of the Zionist imperialist conspiracy, Israel is doing these revolutions for its own interests, the response was basically mockery and laughter. It was not taken seriously. It was taken as a pathetic effort to deflect anger and to deflect attention. And again, that's a very, very healthy development, I think, for all of us, to be putting everything in the proper context and in the proper proportions. Now, in terms of what it means for the conflict, I think in terms of the long term, this is the best hope we have. If we are to have true peace, to have a democratic, open Middle East that respects men and women and minorities, would be a region in which Israel would just feel comfortable. I think in terms of our sense of being threatened, of being insecure, that would change. And I think, in general, you're more likely to have true peace, lasting peace, when it comes from people who respect each other and share values. But in the short term, we can't know. Transitions to democracy are difficult. In many countries, it has taken, at times, decades. Decades that interim, you saw domestic turmoil, ethnic problems, sectarian conflict. All of that could happen. I'm sure, as you know, the Middle East was created, the modern Middle East was created as a result of many agreements between powers in the wake of World War I. When these agreements are beginning to dissolve, what's going to happen are old loyalties, our sectarian conflict, ethnic conflict. If they're going to become more important, transition to democracy might see us through a period of turmoil, which will not be easy for anyone, and there might be violence, clearly not just within the countries, but also violence that spills over. I'm always fascinated historically by these moments where we all keep talking the same talk. So in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we talk in the same terms, about the same ideas, and perhaps history is now taking another vector. It might be changing the parameters of the conflict. The region might be changing in ways, and we will look back and say, we were talking in an old language at the time when a new language was forming. I don't know. I'm just saying we might be at such a moment. Now, looking at this kind of very broad view, I think it's very interesting to take a look at a moment which was, maybe you followed it. In May, this town experienced a kind of duel of the speeches. You know, you had two very good orators basically come to battle on their oratorial skills in many ways. I think it was very interesting to think both President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu have built much of their political careers on their oratorial skills. And I think it was fascinating to see what happened when both of them kind of came to duel it out. But I think what left many people baffled after the dust settled was, why is nothing happening after all these speeches? Because if you look at the positions of Prime Minister Netanyahu as presented in Congress, and the positions of President Obama as presented in AIPAC, they were very close. So I think a lot of people wondered, why was there some underlying tension? And many people focused on the personal issue and the personal chemistry. And in truth, I think in international relations it matters. It's fun, it's interesting, it's great gossip, but I'm not sure it's really consequential. And I think the reason comes from their fundamentally opposed worldviews as to how to handle the changes in the region. I think President Obama is looking what's happening in the region and saying, great changes are taking place. Time is not on Israel's side, so Israel must act now and take great risks for peace now. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is looking at the same region and saying, indeed, great changes are underway, and the least wise thing for me to do right now would be to take great risks for my country. And these are fundamentally opposed worldviews. And they're equally legitimate because no one knows what will happen. But I think each one of those leaders thinks that the other leader really doesn't understand that the other leader doesn't understand how critical it is for Israel to act or how dangerous it is for Israel to act. And personally, I will say that I actually tend to the Israeli Prime Minister's view. It's very difficult for a leader, I think it's one of the most difficult things any leader can ever say, that sometimes the wise thing is to do nothing. Because the people always want their leaders to do something. But sometimes the wise choice is to wait and see, to keep the calm and to reassess your options after a while. And I think with all the changes we're seeing in the Middle East, it is the wise thing to let the developments kind of work themselves through, and when we have better information, to assess our ability to take those great risks. Now, unfortunately, of course, even if the sense is that right now would not be the time to do great things, sometimes we are forced to act and to respond. And one of these things is, of course, the Palestinian decision to go to the United Nations this September and to ask for recognition of Palestine as a state. Now, I think one of the biggest problems is that countries, and I'm sure all of you represent such countries that want peace, countries that do not think that one should have to choose between the Israelis and the Palestinians, that you could actually be both, that you could be for Israel, and that you could be for the Palestinians, and you could be for peace and for compromise. For countries who believe that, I think many of these countries are going to the United Nations to this vote, thinking that by voting for Palestinian state, or for recognition of such a state, they would be serving the cause of peace. And unfortunately, that is absolutely wrong. And that is the sad thing about what's going on. Because I think many well-intentioned countries and people are going into this vote thinking they're voting for peace, they're voting for something that would help the Palestinians and the Israelis reach a solution to the conflict, whereas what is actually going to happen is that through this vote, we will see the extension of the conflict by other means. And I'll say what I mean by that. We have to admit that Israel, for what it is, being the homeland of the Jewish people, was never accepted in the region as such, ever. There was recognition or acceptance of Israel because it exists, because it's strong, but not for what it is. And this battle against Israel and against the Zionist movement has been raging for at least 100 years. From 1917 to 1947, it took the shape of trying to oppose the British Mandate and the immigration of Jews to the land of Israel. From 47-48, when Israel was established, it then took the form of military efforts to fight Israel and to basically take back the cloth and make Israel non-existent. After 25 years, the military option was let go, but then the battle mutated into a different arena, to economic strangulation through the Arab boycotts and through international and domestic terrorism. And ultimately, Israel was able to overcome the boycotts and to build an export-based economy that does not depend on the region. It was able to contain international and domestic terrorism in a way that allows its people a good and decent life and a relatively safe and secure existence. But what we're seeing is that every time Israel is able to meet one of these threats, whether military or economic or terrorism, it's not that we get acceptance, that the other side says, you know what, okay, we get it. The Jewish people have a right to live here. The Jewish people have a historical connection to this region. We accept it. No, what happens is that the battle just mutates into a different arena. And the arena now, we're now at a moment where the battle is being taken to the United Nations, and more broadly speaking, the academia, the social networks, NGOs, and basically that kind of arena. Now, many people say this is a good thing. At least the battle is nonviolent. At least the leadership, the Palestinian leadership, has chosen a nonviolent battle. But we should be very careful to equate the means with the ends. The fact that the means are nonviolent doesn't mean that the ultimate purpose is also positive. And the fact that the means are violent doesn't mean that we're not fighting for something that is good. Around us, we see people using violence to fight for ideals that are very noble. And the fact that there has been a choice of a non-violent struggle against Zionism and against Israel doesn't mean that the purpose is a good one or a positive one. So I think we should be very careful not to make that equation between non-violence and a positive or a good purpose. And this is what it is. This is a non-violent struggle into the very thing that makes Israel what it is, the homeland of the Jewish people. And even worse, by taking the battle to the United Nations, this process is bringing out the worst in the United Nations. And as we look to the 21st century, as we look to the idea of an interdependent world, as we look to the United Nations to be a body where people and countries can work out their problems together, we should realize that this vote is taking advantage of the worst aspect of the United Nations, and that is the majoritarian aspect. We all know that democracies are not just about the rule of the majority. Democracies are about constitutional limits of power, about respect for minorities, and when the UN, especially in the UN General Assembly, there's no constitution. There's no sense of protection for individual countries against the power of the numbers. So in the UN General Assembly, you can pass decisions that do not meet any criteria of fairness or justice just because the numbers are there. And the fact that you can use the numbers in order to promote things that are unjust is very, very dangerous. And as we look to how we build and rebuild the United Nations for the 21st century, we need to make sure that the United Nations is less about majority and numbers and more about constitutional ideas, about the fact that even if a country is only one country, you cannot single out that country repeatedly in a way that is unfair and unjust. Even the U.S. Secretary General has called, for example, the Human Rights Commission that operates on this basis as shameful to the ideals of the United Nations because it allows transgressors, the worst transgressors against human rights, to even share it. It takes Israel, which has problems, but I think one would have to be fair and say actually it's one of the world's, I would say, better countries in terms of its values, repeatedly singling it out for condemnation in a way that is completely unjust, not proportional, and not fair. If we create a United Nations that is built on the idea that you can single out one country just because it's one, and the UN General Assembly or Human Rights Commission has the numbers, and you can do that repeatedly, I think we're creating a United Nations, and in fact we're creating a world which I think would not really respect the ideals that we want. Now, I have to admit that President Abbas has been very honest about why he's going to the United Nations. In the New York Times editorial, and he said it in several events, he said, by going to the United Nations, we will have the legal basis from which we can continue to attack Israel in each and every body that is associated with the UN, and there's about 70 such organizations. So he himself knows, and the Palestinians, they're smart people, they know they're not getting a state by going to the United Nations. And I think it's interesting to note that the Palestinian leader who is most interested in having a state for his people, Salam Fayyad, he's the first Palestinian leader to say, I don't care what the Jews are doing. I don't care what Israel is doing. I want a state for us. I want the sovereignty and dignity of independence for the Palestinian people, even if we don't get complete justice. And in that respect, I think Israelis respect him very much because they see the values that have helped us build our country. Chaim Weizmann, the first Israeli president, who was a very important leader in the Zionist movement, he said to the United Nations, he said, we, the Jewish people, will accept a state even if it's the size of a napkin. And the Jewish people did not look for complete justice. They looked for dignity and sovereignty in a state, even if it was small, because that was what is important for us to move forward, to look to the future rather than to look to the past. And yes, the creation of Israel has caused injustice to the Palestinians. But if the Palestinians pursue complete justice, it will come only if Israel doesn't exist. And that is not the kind of justice that the world wants. So for them to move forward, for them to have a country of their own, to have sovereignty and dignity, they have to let go of the idea of complete justice and accept that in life, in international life, and in the life of people, you sometimes have to do with less in order to move forward and to have more. And I think, and it's amazing to know, the Palestinian leader who thinks that way, Salam Fayyad, who has been doing everything to make sure that the Palestinians are ready to have a state. And if they will have a state, it is thanks to him, because he is the one who's going to make a state possible. And he has opposed from the beginning, and still today, the Palestinians going to the United Nations. because he knows that by going to the United Nations, they are endangering the possibility of having a real state. They are merely continuing the conflict in another arena, and he wants a real state. Not a virtual state in New York, but a real state in Ramallah and in Gaza. So I think it's very important that countries that are in favor of peace, that are in favor of establishing a United Nations that is based on rules and that can defend minorities, can defend a single country even if it's alone, cannot vote for this resolution in September. Because ultimately the cause of peace will only be served through negotiations, and they're not pleasant for anyone. But that's how you get a real country rather than a virtual one. And I think it's very important to send a message that those who favor peace will not be supporting the cause of peace if they support this resolution. Some of you might say, but negotiations are not possible. They did not happen. The Palestinians are going to the United Nations because they have no choice. That is not the case. I think one of the tragedies of the current Israeli government is that even though it has done more than many other governments to further the ability of negotiations and compromise, this has gone completely unacknowledged. Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think it's interesting to note, he is the Prime Minister second time around under which rule the least number of Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians, have been killed. Every time he's been in power, we have had incredible calm and security and greater prosperity for both sides. He has been willing to freeze the settlement building, and I'm no supporter of the settlement project, but he has done something that was unprecedented for any prime minister from the left or the right. And even after the settlement freeze is over, he has built the least in the last 30 years. This has been the government that has been the least settlement happy of all the governments. Again and again, he has made declarations accepting a Palestinian state, something that he was not willing to do in the past, accepting the need for compromise, talking about the fact that many Israeli settlements would not be part of a future, could not be part of a future Israel. These are huge steps for someone like him, and he's in power and enjoys widespread support. And yet the sense is that once and again, the opportunity to negotiate has been rejected, and the option of going to the United Nations, thinking that this is somehow the easier route, because one does not have to deal with the very annoying Israel, that is what has really happened. So I think with everything that's happening in the Arab world around us, I think there is a hopeful future ahead. With the fact that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is beginning to come into the more proper proportions in the Middle East, I think that also creates opportunities. The Israeli government is a strong government that even if it talks tough and the tone is tough, has engaged in actions that have been very moderate and ones that certainly have opened up space in negotiations. And I really think if this vote in the UN will pass, I think it will be a sad moment because we will now find ourselves again going for 2 or 3 more decades of a new type of conflict, a legal conflict, a UN conflict, but we will not have served the cause of peace, and I think we will also have hurt the United Nations in its ability to adapt itself to 21st century and to create an atmosphere and an organization that is fair and just and allows individual countries to really prosper and not be repeatedly singled out. So these are my opening remarks. I am really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. What are your perspectives from your countries on the region at large, certainly, and if you'd like, on this specific issue. So thank you.